Okay, let's dive into something that it starts with a scene you've probably seen, maybe even recently,
Yeah.
but where our source material goes with it.
That's the interesting part.
Right, picture it.
Yep.
Kids, often teenage boys, right? On a university campus, maybe downtown.
Yeah, exactly. And they've got skateboards. They're not just riding them, they're using the actual buildings, the steps, the handrails, everything. Like it's their personal obstacle course. Sliding down rails, launching off ledges.
Sometimes they nail it. Looks amazing. Sometimes, not so much. Big wipeout. But then they just, dust themselves off, grab the board.
And go right back to try it again.
Yeah. And maybe your first thought, like mine often is oof, that looks pretty dangerous. Or
Yeah.
maybe, hey, they shouldn't be doing that there.
Sure, that's a common reaction. But this piece of writing we're digging into today, it pushes back on that. It sees those kids and thinks, wow, that's actually amazing. Calls them brave even. Says they deserve honest admiration.
Which feels a bit counterintuitive at first. But here's the core idea the source throws out right away. For these kids, danger isn't really the enemy. It's not something they're trying desperately to avoid.
It's almost the point, in a way. They're not focused on safety above all else. They're laser focused on getting good at it, on becoming competent.
And the source makes this argument that competence is what actually makes people safe in the long run. Or, as safe as anyone can really be.
Mm-hmm. So this deep dive, it's all based on this really fascinating piece that starts with skateboarding, but then whoosh, it spirals out.
Yeah, connected to risk, psychology, how society works, culture, big stuff.
So our plan today is to unpack this source for you. We'll pull out the key insights, see how it connects these seemingly unrelated things like skate parks and playgrounds, ancient philosophy, political ideas, even fairy tales.
Get ready, because it might just give you a whole new way of looking at things you thought were pretty straightforward.
Okay, let's really get into that skateboarding scene. The source paints a picture, right? The rough steps, those metal handrails, the speed you need, the trick itself, the landing, graceful or painful.
Right, and it contrasts that with the author's own feelings, like they wouldn't dare try that, or climb a crane, or whatever, even though they've done other risky things like flying in a stunt plane. But that felt different, controlled.
And this leads to a really central idea in the source. People, especially kids, they don't just try to eliminate risk. That's not the primary drive.
What is it then?
The source says they try to optimize it, find the right level of risk. Because risk, handled right, is how you grow, how you learn your limits, how you achieve things.
If you make everything too safe.
They'll find danger somewhere else, often in ways you have less control over. The source argues it's almost like a developmental need, this dance with risk.
That makes me think about playgrounds. The source brings this up, right? That whole panic a while back about insurance and liability.
Oh, yeah. Suddenly, all the cool stuff disappeared. Swings, monkey bars, high slides, gone. In places like Toronto, the source says kids had basically nothing for like a year.
And what happened? The source mentions seeing kids, bored kids, running around on the roof of the local school.
Exactly. Which is probably way more dangerous than the playground equipment ever was. The argument is that playgrounds need a certain amount of challenge, of perceived danger, to actually work, to be engaging.
And you see the flip side of this, the overprotection. Physically manifested, right? The source talks about skate stoppers.
Ugh, those things. Those ugly metal bits they bolt onto ledges and planters, specifically to stop skateboarding.
Yeah, the source has some strong words about them. Calls them a dismal impression of poor design, resentment, and badly executed afterthoughts.
And that line, it's powerful. The sheer harsh ugliness of the solution makes a lie of the reasons for its implementation. It's like the ugliness itself betrays something else going on. It physically stops the activity, sure, but it also just makes the place look worse, harsher.
So we've got the skateboarding, the playgrounds, these physical barriers, but then the source pivots. It asks, okay, what's behind this drive to clamp down, to remove risk and challenge? Are there deeper psychological things going on?
Yeah, this is where it gets into some, let's say, heavier psychological territory. It brings in thinkers who really looked at the dark side of human motivation. Freud, Jung, Nietzsche.
People who weren't afraid to suggest our motives aren't always pure or straightforward.
Exactly. Freud's hidden wishes, Jung's shadow self, and Nietzsche's idea of resentment.
No sentiment. Okay, explain that one. Sounds like resentment, obviously, but more specific.
It is. The source explains it as a kind of curdled resentment. It's not just being angry or envious. It's when that bitterness actually motivates actions that look virtuous or selfless on the surface.
Like you're doing something good, but secretly it's fueled by wanting to bring others down.
Kind of. Nietzsche used this image of tarantulas, people who feel powerless and say, we'll get revenge on everyone we're not equal to. And sometimes, the source suggests, quoting Nietzsche, this will to equality can be a mask for a hidden desire for power, for tyranny.
Wow. Okay, how does the source illustrate this?
It uses a really interesting example from George Orwell, The Road to Wigan Pier. You know the book?
Vaguely. About miners in England.
Right. The first half is just brutal. Orwell describes the horrific conditions of coal miners in the 1930s, crawling miles underground, terrible poverty, lack of basic health. The source says basically only a monster wouldn't feel sympathy after reading that part.
Okay, but then...
But then in the second half, Orwell does something unexpected. He starts analyzing why socialism wasn't more popular, despite all this obvious inequality. And he suggests, controversially, that some social reformers, well, maybe they didn't actually like the poor all that much.
What does that mean?
Orwell's idea, as the source presents it, was that some reformers just hated the rich. Their calls for social justice, their piety, might have been in some cases a way to channel their own resentment and jealousy, rather than pure altruism.
It's a challenging thought.
It is. And it leads the source to introduce this tool, attributed kind of loosely to Carl Jung, a psychological scalpel.
Okay, sounds intense.
The idea is, if you really can't understand why someone did something, look very carefully at the consequences of their actions, and then tentatively try to infer the motivation from those consequences.
So work backwards from the outcome.
Yeah. The source warns it's a tool of last resort, easy to misuse, but sometimes, it claims, it can shed light.
So applying that scalpel back to the skate stoppers.
Right. What are the results? The source points them out. Unhappy adolescent males and brutalist aesthetic disregard of beauty, harsh environment, frustrated kids.
And the provocative question the source poses is, maybe that wasn't an accident. Maybe on some level that was the aim.
It's a disturbing question. The source suggests that whenever someone is loudly proclaiming high principles as a reason to change other people's behavior, you should maybe look at how willing they are to apply those principles to themselves. It sees a potentially insidious and profoundly anti-human spirit behind things that discourage skill, courage, and challenging activities.
And this idea, this anti-human spirit, the source tries to make it concrete with a very personal, very difficult story about a friend, a guy named Chris.
Yeah, this is a major part of the source material. The author knew Chris well and believed he was deeply affected by this kind of spirit, which played a huge role in his mental health struggles and ultimately his death.
The source gives some background. Chris grew up in northern Alberta, had run-ins, fights with native kids. The source is careful to provide context about the history there, the tensions. It wasn't simple.
No, definitely not. And there's one really specific story about a kid named Rene Heck. Rene apparently mouthed off to the author's father, who was his teacher, called him a cow or something. And the author, being a kid, thought it was funny, maybe joined in taunting Rene later. But Rene heard him and threatened him after school.
Uh-oh. And they were supposed to go see a movie together that night.
Yeah, awkward timing. So after school, the author bolts for the bike racks. Rene corners him. They end up circling the racks, the author yelling apologies, Rene just furious and hurt.
How did it end?
The author finally yelled something like, "Look, I'm sorry I called you a cow. Can we still go to the movie?" And apparently it was genuine. He really meant it.
And Rene.
Rene just stopped, stared at him, and then burst into tears and ran away. The source reflects on that moment, calling it kind of representative of the complex, painful relationships in that town at that time. They never went to the movie.
So how does this relate to Chris later on?
Well, the source connects it to Chris's later stance. When Chris would get into confrontations with native kids, he refused to fight back, even self-defense. He'd say things like, "We stole their land, it's wrong, of course they're angry."
You feel guilty.
Deeply. The source describes him withdrawing, developing this intense negativity towards masculinity, towards normal life activities, school, career, relationships, seeing it all as somehow complicit in terrible things like colonization, war, environmental damage. He apparently got into some Buddhist ideas and felt that negating his own existence was almost an ethical duty.
Wow, that's heavy. Did this manifest in his actions?
Yeah, the source gives examples. When they were college roommates, Chris apparently used to go out late at night and just snap off car mirrors. His justification was that the owners were part of the problem, ruining the planet, so they deserved it.
And the author's reaction?
The author argued back, like, you're just attacking random people trying to live their lives.
Things got worse later.
Seems so. Chris was kind of adrift, ended up moving in with the author and his wife, Tammy, and their baby, which was complicated because Chris apparently had feelings for Tammy before.
Oh.
Yeah. And the source describes Chris becoming increasingly bitter. His hatred shifted from just men to include women, too. He wanted relationships, but seemed to despise the normal ways people form them: education, work, expressing desire in a healthy way. He was unemployed, chain-smoking. The resentment was palpable.
The source includes a story about dinner, right?
The burning dinner incident. Yeah, it's pretty chilling. It was Chris's turn to cook. Tammy gets home, the apartment's full of smoke, burgers are charred black on the stove.
And Chris.
Chris is kneeling on the floor by the stove, looking totally overwhelmed and pathetic, but the source says Tammy saw right through it instantly.
Saw through what?
She knew he'd burned the dinner on purpose, out of resentment for having to do it. The whole kneeling by the stove thing was an act, playing the victim.
How did she react?
Gently, apparently, but she called him on it. And Chris, his act exposed, became absolutely furious. Not sad, but enraged that his pride was wounded. The source just calls it an ugly situation.
Yeah, sounds it. And things continue to deteriorate.
Seems that way. The next day, the author and Tammy took a walk just to get out. It was freezing, miserable weather. And they saw all these squirrels out, looking sick, half bald, shivering in the lethal cold.
Weird.
The source describes it as feeling impossible, inexplicable, exactly appropriate. Like the miserable state of the squirrels perfectly mirrored the toxic feeling back in the apartment. It felt like an absurdist play. Tammy left for a while shortly after that.
There was another incident, too, involving the author's brother.
Right, near Christmas. The brother and his wife came to visit. Chris was apparently visibly uncomfortable, resentful of these strangers in his space. The author even made a dark joke about Chris looking like a serial killer because of his clothes and demeanor.
In bed.
That night, the author couldn't sleep, had a bad feeling. Went to check on Chris around 4 a.m., found him wide awake, just staring. The author says he spent time talking him down from his murderous rage.
Whoa, against the brother.
Seems implied. The brother, the next day, clearly sensed something was deeply wrong, asking what the hell was going on. The author reflects they felt genuinely lucky, nothing terrible happened, like they'd been visited by the spirit of Cain, that biblical jealousy and destructiveness.
Good grief. The source even mentioned something about a smell.
Yeah, it's a strange detail, but evocative. A distinct bitter odor around Chris that washing couldn't remove. A social worker friend apparently recognized it, called it the smell of the unemployable. The source saw it as a physical sign of his inner state, mind and body, completely out of harmony.
And how did Chris's story end?
Tragically, he did manage to get a job for a bit. He called the author the night before his 40th birthday, apparently really happy because a story he'd written was getting published. The source emphasizes he was a talented writer and photographer. But the next day, he died by suicide. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his truck. The source ends that section with the devastating words of Chris's father. My beautiful boy.
That's incredibly sad, and the source uses this very painful story to make a broader point.
Yes. It argues that this destructive, anti-human spirit wasn't unique to Chris. It connects it to a seemingly very different person, a professor who spoke at a TEDx event the author organized.
What was the connection?
This professor gave a technically brilliant talk, but the core message was that humanity is basically a disease on the planet. He advocated for having fewer children, showed images of factory workers presented as sterile, inhuman robots.
Okay.
But the source points out the irony. There were Chinese students in the audience whose parents had escaped Mao's Cultural Revolution, whose lives were actually better because of jobs in those kinds of factories. The source sees the same dread spirit, fundamentally anti-human, in both the professor's abstract arguments and Chris's tragic trajectory. It questions if the professor really understood where those kinds of ideas can ultimately lead.
So the story of Chris acts as a kind of bridge from individual psychology to broader societal ideas and intellectual movements that the source critiques.
Exactly. The source starts grouping people, the professor, Chris, even mentioning the Columbine shooter Eric Harris's writings about humanity being corrupt under this label of self-appointed judges of the human race.
And the logic there, according to the source,
is pretty chilling. If you genuinely believe humanity is a plague or a cancer, then, well, eliminating it could seem like a good thing, even heroic, which logically can point towards self-destruction.
It does raise that question, the source asks. Why is it considered virtuous in some circles to say the planet would be better off without so many people when saying something similar about any specific group of people would be completely unacceptable.
Right. The source detects a kind of morbid glee behind some of those statements, a skeletal, grinning face. And it asks why people who are often very vocal against prejudice can simultaneously seem to condemn humanity as a whole.
The source then shifts focus to the potential impact of these kinds of ideas, particularly on young people in universities,
Uh-huh.
especially young men.
Yes. It argues that constantly being told you're part of an oppressive group, that your very existence is problematic, that you're sexually suspect just for being male, that this takes a heavy toll on mental health, particularly in humanities departments.
And it connects this to academic performance.
It does. It points to data showing young men falling behind academically, mentions the author's son saying he was doing well for a boy because it was just assumed girls did better, cites an Economist cover calling males the weaker sex.
And there's data on university enrollment, too.
Yeah, the source presents some stark figures. Women making up well over half of students in most disciplines, and in huge fields like healthcare, psychology, education, it's approaching 80% female. And the gap is widening fast.
The source sees this as a problem.
A big one. Calls it catastrophic news for men, but also stresses it's not good news for women either. It suggests this imbalance isn't healthy for society overall.
Why does the source think this is happening? It touches on differences between boys and girls, right?
It does. It talks about average differences, boys being, on average, more disobedient, less agreeable, less anxious after puberty, more interested in things versus people.
But isn't the argument usually that those are socially constructed?
That's the common argument, but the source pushes back hard here. It cites research, particularly from Scandinavia, places that have tried the hardest to create gender equality, showing that these psychological differences actually become more pronounced, not less, when social pressures are reduced.
So biology plays a bigger role than often acknowledged.
That's the source's strong assertion. It says quite bluntly, this isn't a debate, the data are in. It argues these differences are deeply rooted.
And how does this relate to boys leaving certain environments, like maybe university humanities departments?
The source offers a theory about competition and status. It suggests girls can gain status both within their own group and by competing well against boys. Boys, however, tend to gain status primarily within the male hierarchy. If they excel at things perceived as girls' games, they might actually lose status with both boys and girls.
So as an environment starts to feel more like a girl's game.
The boys tend to disengage and leave. The source asks provocatively if universities, especially humanities, are becoming that kind of game and whether that's what people really want.
This critique then broadens out to the intellectual traditions the source sees as underlying some of these trends. It points fingers at Marxism.
Yes, and its descendants. It mentions Max Horkheimer in critical theory, the idea that Western principles are just a mask for inequality. And Jacques Derrida, a key figure in postmodernism, who the source notes even described his own work as a kind of radicalized Marxism. The baseline Marxist idea being that society is fundamentally about economic oppression.
And the source is pretty blunt about the results of applying those ideas.
Extremely blunt. It lists the consequences of 20th century communist regimes, Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, etc. Forced redistribution, collectivization, state control, leading, the source emphasizes, to tens of millions of deaths, famine, oppression, lies. It gives the horrifying example of Khieu Samphan in Cambodia using his PhD theories to justify the killing fields. The takeaway is stark. Ideas have consequences.
And it notes that many intellectuals in the West were slow to acknowledge these horrors.
Yeah, it suggests many remained sympathetic to communism long after the atrocities were known, mentioning figures like Orwell and Malcolm Muggeridge as notable exceptions who tried to sound the alarm early.
But then came Solzhenitsyn.
Right, the Gulag Archipelago. The source argues this book completely destroyed any remaining moral credibility communism might have had. It showed that tyranny wasn't a mistake or deviation. It was baked into the ideology from the start, propped up by lies. After that, the source claims, defending communism became impossible for anyone honest.
But the underlying critique didn't just disappear.
No, the source argues it just shapeshifted. It points to thinkers like Derrida, suggesting he effectively swapped power for money as the central oppressive force. So now it wasn't the rich oppressing the poor, it was the powerful oppressing basically everyone else.
A linguistic shift.
A crucial one, according to the source, because it allowed the fundamental worldview that society is primarily about oppression and group conflict to survive the collapse of the economic theory.
And Derrida's idea was that this oppression is built into language itself, into categories.
That's the interpretation presented,
Yeah.
that hierarchies exist only to exclude. The category woman only exists so men can benefit. Male and female exist to oppress those who don't fit. Science benefits scientists, politics benefits politicians. All hierarchies thrive on excluding others.
Which connects to nothing outside the text. The idea that it's all interpretation.
Yeah, that everything's subjective, no objective truth, just power plays through language.
How does the source respond to that?
It acknowledges there might be a tiny grain of truth. Power is a motivator sometimes, but it argues it's definitely not the only motivator, or even the main one in many cases. Just because we don't know everything doesn't mean all interpretations are equally good. Some are harmful, some just don't work in reality. Life has real limits. Endless interpretations might sound freeing, but the source argues there's a limited number of actual viable solutions to life's problems.
And this leads to a question about public funding.
Right. Why, the source asks, should public money support institutions or educators whose goal seems to be dismantling the very culture that funds them? Especially when, in the source's view, the core claims like the West being uniquely patriarchal or all hierarchies being solely about power lack solid evidence.
It brings up crustaceans again.
Yeah. The point being, hierarchies are ancient, they exist in nature. Do male crustaceans oppress female crustaceans? It's a rhetorical way of questioning the idea that all hierarchy is purely a human social construct based on power.
So what is the prime determiner of status, according to the source, in reasonably functional societies?
Competence, ability, skill, not just power. The example given is, who do you want operating on your brain tumor? You want the most competent surgeon, regardless of their power in other senses.
And there's evidence for competence mattering.
The source cites social science research showing traits like intelligence and conscientiousness are strong predictors of success in Western societies. It argues this is very well-supported data. Teaching ideological theories that ignore this, the source claims, is like teaching the world is flat. It's indoctrination, not education.
It also critiques the logic behind insisting all gender differences are social constructs.
Yeah, it points out the logical inconsistency, like how does that fit with the real experiences of transgender people? But it argues the reason for insisting on 100% social construction is strategic.
Strategic how?
If you want to justify using societal force to make all group outcomes perfectly equal, you have to believe that any existing differences are only the result of unfair social conditioning. Otherwise, your justification for radical intervention collapses. The conclusion, equality must be forced, dictates the premise. All differences are constructed.
And the source says achieving that kind of perfect group equality is impossible anyway.
Fundamentally impossible. Life is too complex. Just comparing groups on one dimension like income is hard enough. What about all the other things that matter? And how do you even define the groups? Race, ethnicity, disability. These categories fragment down to the individual. Every person is unique, the source states. Group identity politics ignores this fundamental complexity.
Trying to force it would have cost.
Huge costs. The source mentions twin studies showing culture can be pushed to influence outcomes, but maybe only through extreme measures. Trying to eliminate innate gender differences, it suggests, would require immense pressure, a kind of societal retraining. It asks what that looks like, bringing up Mao's Cultural Revolution as a terrifying example of where such utopian engineering can lead. And this brings us back, doesn't it? Back to the concerns about trying to engineer human nature, specifically the idea of socializing boys to be more like girls.
Right. The source addresses that directly, the theory that if we just raise boys differently, encourage more tenderness, cooperation, less aggression,
then male violence and dominance will just fade away.
But the source doesn't buy it.
Not at all. It argues aggression isn't just learned behavior you can unteach. It's innate, biological, there at the beginning, basic brain circuitry.
So how do most boys get socialized then, if not by acting like girls?
By learning to integrate and channel that aggressive drive into productive, socially acceptable forms. Competition, striving, determination, standing up for things. The source argues that aggression underlies a lot of positive traits too. It's unsocialized aggression that's the problem, leading to antisocial behavior. But the drive itself has value, even for self-protection.
And it flips the script too, suggesting that sometimes the problem isn't too much aggression, but too little.
Exactly. It introduces this idea from clinical observation, compassion as a vice. The source says many clients, especially women, but also some men, suffer because they are too agreeable, too accommodating, not assertive enough. That's what assertiveness training is for.
What are the downsides of being too agreeable?
The source lists them. Always doing things for others, treating objects like children, being naive about others' intentions, avoiding conflict even when necessary, sacrificing yourself constantly without getting anything back. It can seem virtuous, but it becomes damaging, counterproductively one-sided.
And that leads to
Resentment. Because you expect people to reciprocate your sacrifices, but they often don't, especially if you don't ask or demand it.
So what should you do if you feel that resentment because you're being taken advantage of?
The source argues you have a moral obligation to speak up. It acknowledges this is hard. You have
Yeah.
to figure out what you want, state your case, maybe gather evidence, and brace yourself for the other person's reaction. Could be anger, could be tears.
Tears can be tricky.
Very. The source notes that tears aren't always sadness. They can be anger or frustration too. Look for the flushed face. But standing your ground calmly is key to gaining respect.
And you need to be clear about what you actually want.
Crucial. Don't just complain vaguely that's the voice of resentment. Figure out a specific reasonable request or alternative. Assume they might just be ignorant of your needs before assuming they're malicious. But you have to articulate it. If you don't, you just get walked on, become bitter, maybe even develop a dependent personality.
The source contrasts this with another type of personality, the edible mother.
Yeah, presented as almost the opposite problem, but equally damaging. This is the parent who overfunctions, does everything for the child, fosters complete dependency. The implicit deal is, you never leave me and I'll protect you from everything, do everything for you. You'll end up useless and bitter, but hey, you'll never have to be responsible.
That sounds suffocating. The source connects this to Hansel and Gretel.
It does. Reinterprets the witch as this terrible mother archetype, the dark, devouring aspect of the feminine, of chaos. She fattens the kids up, consumes their spirit. Gretel pushing her into the oven is seen as a necessary act of separation and self-assertion. Overprotection kills the soul.
It brings in Jungian ideas here, too, about masculine and feminine principles.
Right. The idea that consciousness, symbolically masculine, whether in men or women, has to struggle to emerge from the unconscious maternal matrix, symbolically feminine. It's a painful process, and the temptation is always there to just sink back into dependency. Anything that encourages that dependency, including overprotection, works against development, against competence.
And this terrible mother archetype shows up elsewhere.
Oh yeah, Tiamat, the chaos dragon. Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty, her curse is overcome by the prince, representing mature consciousness. Ursula in The Little Mermaid, taking Ariel's voice, her logos, trying to usurp the king. These myths, the source argues, tell us that developing requires engaging with the masculine principle of order and consciousness, confronting the scary world, and sometimes resisting the feminine pull towards undifferentiated safety or dependence. We need both, in balance.
The source contrasts this with its own mother.
Yeah, a really touching little anecdote. The author's playing softball, about to get in a fight. His mom walks by, sees what's happening, and just keeps walking, doesn't intervene.
Wow, that must have been hard for her.
The author assumes so, but sees it as her doing the right thing, letting him learn to handle things himself. She later told him, when he was a difficult teen, if it was too good at home, you'd never leave. Tender-hearted, the source says, but not an Oedipal mother. She knew the importance of independence.
Then the source shifts to how men socialize each other, using the railway crew example.
Right. A tough, all-male environment. New guys were tested, relentlessly teased, nicknames, harassment. It sounds harsh, but the source argues it served a purpose.
What purpose?
To build camaraderie, evaluate character, see who could handle the difficult, dangerous work, who was reliable, who could take a joke, who pulled their weight.
And there was the guy, lunch bucket.
Yeah, the guy who couldn't handle it, complained, was touchy, had a bad attitude. The teasing just escalated because he reacted poorly. They started throwing pebbles at his hard hat.
Ouch.
Yeah. Instead of learning to roll with it or push back effectively, he just got angry and irritated. And eventually, he just disappeared, didn't come back.
So the source spells out the code on that crew.
Pretty clearly, do your job, pay attention, no whining, stand up for your friends, don't kiss up, don't be overly sensitive, and fundamentally, don't be dependent at all, ever, period. The harassment was a filter. Are you tough, competent, reliable, maybe even entertaining? If not, this isn't the place for you. No coddling.
This connects to that old Charles Atlas ad. The insult that made a man out of Mac.
Hilariously, yes. Skinny guy gets bullied, girl is disappointed, he gets strong, comes back, punches the bully, wins the girl.
Seems simplistic.
The source argues it captures something fundamental about male motivation and female expectations, at least traditionally. Mac's shame wasn't illegitimate, he was inadequate in that situation. But he used it as fuel, a compensatory fantasy that led to real action. He became the hero. Everyone benefits.
And the source argues women actually benefit from men not being dependent.
Yes. Cites the practical reality. Many women don't want a partner. They have to take care of like another child. They want an equal, someone capable. Awake and conscious women want an awake and conscious partner. A man shouldn't be a perpetual child.
It even brings in Nelson Muntz from The Simpsons.
Huh. Yeah, as the bully who provides a necessary social collective against excessive weakness or pathos like Milhouse, Nelson's contempt sets boundaries. But the source notes he's not pure evil, he has his own struggles, and his weird appeal to Lisa. Maybe it's the fascination the soft culture has with repressed hardness, like 50 Shades of Grey tapping into something similar.
Which leads to a warning.
A serious one. If you pathologize and repress normal masculine traits like hardness or dominance, they don't vanish. They might fester in the unconscious and erupt in unhealthy ways. Pushing too hard for feminization could paradoxically create interest in harsh authoritarian ideologies. The source connects this to things like Fight Club, maybe even the rise of Trump or far-right movements. A backlash.
And so the conclusion is that men need to toughen up.
Yes, by pushing themselves and challenging each other, those risky things teenage boys do. The source reframes them not as just stupidity, but as attempts to test limits, build competence, become useful, maybe even push against authority to see if it's solid.
And what about women? What do healthy women want, according to this perspective?
Men, not boys. Someone to contend with, someone strong, maybe stronger or smarter than them in some ways, someone who brings something different to the table. This, the source suggests, is why very high-achieving women sometimes find dating difficult. The pool of men perceived as higher status shrinks. Ultimately, the source circles back to that spirit that interferes, the one that crippled Chris. It argues the spirit doesn't just oppose boys becoming strong men, it opposes women standing on their own 2 feet too. It's anti-consciousness, anti-human, driven by resentment and a desire for failure. No one aiming for positive growth aligns with it.
In that final, really stark warning from the source.
Yeah, if you think tough men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of.
Which brings us right back around to the very beginning. That simple image, that simple rule.
Leave children alone when they are skateboarding.
Wow, okay, that really was a journey. All from skateboarding. We went through risk, competence, resentment, that incredibly intense story about Chris, critiques of Marxism, postmodernism, gender dynamics, mythology.
It really covers a lot of ground. The core argument we've unpacked from the source is that trying to bubble wrap life, to eliminate all risk and challenge, even with the best intentions, can seriously backfire. It can prevent people from developing the very competence they need.
Yeah, and the source really pushes on the motivations behind some of those efforts, suggesting that resentment, or what it calls an anti-human spirit, can sometimes hide behind calls for safety or equality. It champions hierarchies based on actual competence and warns against ignoring real differences or discouraging that drive to achieve.
It's definitely a challenging perspective, sometimes uncomfortable. It makes a strong case that strength, resilience, even a degree of toughness are necessary, and that weakening individuals in the name of safety or a certain kind of equality might create bigger dangers down the road.
So for you listening, what really stood out? Did that idea of the psychological scalpel looking at consequences to guess motivations spark any thoughts about things you see around you? How do these arguments about risk, competence, and maybe the gender dynamics resonate with your own experience?
Yeah, the aim isn't really to provide neat answers. It's more about offering a different lens, maybe connecting some dots you hadn't connected before, looking under the surface a bit.
And maybe leaving you with that final, very provocative thought to chew on. If you think tough men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of. What happens to a society or to individuals when the very processes that build strength and resilience are actively discouraged? Definitely something to ponder.